That Lass O Lowries. A Lancashire Story by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Narrated by Malc Cowle on behalf of the Northern Grove Publishing Project and in support of the Working Class Movement Library, 51 The Crescent, Salford, M5 4WX. That Lass O Lowries. Chapter 1. They did not look like women, or at least a stranger new to the district might easily have been misled by their appearance as they stood together in a group by the pit's mouth. There were about a dozen of them, all pit girls as they were called, women who wore a dress more than half masculine and who talked loudly and laughed discordantly, and some of whom, God knows, had faces as hard and brutal as the hardest of their collier brothers and husbands and sweethearts. They had lived their lives among the coal pits and had worked early and late at the mouth ever since they'd been old enough to take part in the heavy labour. It was not to be wondered at that they had lost all bloom of womanly modesty and gentleness. Their mothers had been pit girls in their time, their grandmothers in theirs. They had been born in coarse homes. They had fared hardly and worked hard. They had breathed in the dust and grime of coal, and somehow or other it seemed to stick to them and reveal itself in their natures as it did in their bold, unwashed faces. At first one shrank from them, but one's shrinking could not fail to change to pity. There was not an element of softness to rule or even influence them in their half-savage existence. On the particular evening of which I speak, the group at the pit's mouth were even more than usually noisy. They were laughing, gossiping, and joking, coarse enough jokes, and now and then a listener might have heard an oath flung out carelessly, and as if all were well used to the sound. Most of them were young women, though there were a few older ones among them, and the principal figure in the group, the central figure about whom the rest clustered, was a young woman. But she differed from the rest in 2 or 3 respects. The others seemed somewhat stunted in growth. She was tall enough to be imposing. She was as roughly clad as the poorest of them, but she wore her uncouth garb differently. The man's jacket of fustian, open at the neck, bared a handsome sun-brown throat. The man's hat shaded a face with dark eyes that had a sort of animal beauty and a well-moulded chin. It was at this girl that all the rough jokes seemed to be directed. "I'll tell thee, Joan," said one woman, "we'st ha' thy sweethearting wi' him afore month's out." "Aye," laughed her fellows, "so we shall. Thou hast to turn soft after all. Thou canna stand out against London, chap. We'st ha' thy sweethearting, Joan, in face of all that's said." Joan Lowry faced them defiantly. "Thou'st noan had me sweethearting with such a fool," she said. "I am no fond of men folk at no time. I've had me fill on 'em, and I'm noan like to take up with such like as this un. And he's noan a Londoner neither. He's only from south, and south is no Lunnon." "He's getting Lunnon ways, though," put in another, chopping his words up and mincing 'em small. "He's noan Lancashire. Honey gout can tell." "I dinna see as he minces so," said Joan roughly. "He dunna speak how like, but he's well enough in his way." A boisterous peal of laughter interrupted her. "I thought thou'd called him a fool a minute sin'," cried 2 or 3 voices at once. Joan, lass, thou'st going to change thy mind, I see." The girl's eyes flashed dangerously. "There's others I could call fools," she said. "I needna go far to find fools. Fool hunting's the best sport out, and safest. Leave th' engineer alone, and leave me alone too. It'll be the best for you." She turned round and strode out of the group. Another burst of derisive laughter followed her, but she took no notice of it. She took no notice of anything, not even of the 2 men who at that very moment passed her, and passing, turned to look at her as she went by. "A fine creature," said one of them. "A fine creature," echoed the other. "Yes, and you see, that is precisely it, Derek. A fine creature, and nothing else. Do you wonder at my dissatisfaction?" They were the young civil engineer and his friend, the Reverend Paul Grace, curate of the parish. There were never two men more unlike, physically and mentally, and yet it would have been a hard task to find two natures more harmonious and sympathetic. Still, most people wondered at and failed to comprehend their friendship. The mild, nervous little curate barely reached Derek's shoulder. His finely cut face was singularly feminine and innocent. The mild eyes beaming from behind his small spectacles had an absent, dreamy look. One could not fail to see at the first glance that this refined, restless, conscientious little gentleman was hardly the person to cope successfully with Riggan. Derek strode by his side like a young son of Anak, brains and muscles evenly balanced and fully developed. He turned his head over his shoulders to look at Joan Lowrie once again, before replying to Grace's remark. "No, I do not," he said after the second glance. "I am equally dissatisfied myself." Grace warmed at once. Being all nerve and brain, he was easily moved, especially where his sense of duty was touched. "That girl," said he, "has worked at the pit's mouth from her childhood. Her mother was a pit girl until she died, of hard work, privation, and ill treatment. Her father is a collier, and lives as most of them do, drinking, rioting, fighting. Their home is such a home as you have seen dozens of since you came here. The girl could not better it if she tried, and would not know how to begin if she felt inclined. She has borne, they tell me, such treatment as would have killed most women. She has been beaten, bruised, fell to the earth by this father of hers, who is said to be a perfect fiend in his cups, and yet she holds to her place in their wretched hovel, and makes herself a slave to the fellow with a dogged, stubborn determination. What can I do with such a case as that, Derek?" "You have tried to make friends with the girl?" said Derek. Grace coloured sensitively. "There is not a man, woman, or child in the parish," he answered, "with whom I have not conscientiously tried to make friends. And there is scarcely one, I think, with whom I have succeeded. Why can I not succeed? Why do I always fail? The fault must be with myself." "A mistake that, at the outset," interposed Derek. "There is no fault in the matter. There is simply misfortune. Your parishioners are so unfortunate as not to be able to understand you, and on your part you were so unfortunate as to fail at first to place yourself on the right footing with them. I say at first, you observe. Give yourself time, Grace, and give them time too." "Thank you," said the Reverend Paul. "But speaking of this girl, that lass of Lowries, as she is always called, Joan, I believe her name is, Joan Lowrie is, I can assure you, a weight upon me. I cannot help her, and I cannot rid my mind of her. She stands apart from her fellows. She has most of the faults of her class, but none of their follies, and she has the reputation of being half feared, half revered. The man who dared to approach her with the coarse love-making which is the fashion among them would rue it to the last day of his life. She seems to defy all the world, and it is impossible to win upon her. More than impossible. The first time I went to her with sympathy, I felt myself a child in her hands. She never laughed nor jeered at me, as the rest do. She stood before me like a rock, listening until I had finished speaking. 'Parson,' she said, 'if thou'lt leave me alone, I'll leave thee alone,' and then turned about and walked into the house. I am nothing but the parson to these people, and the parson is one for whom they have little respect and no sympathy.' He was not far wrong. The stolid, heavy-natured colliers openly looked down upon parson, a bit of a whipper-snapper, Even the best-natured called him in sovereign contempt for his insignificant physical proportions. Truly, the sensitive little gentleman's lines had not fallen in pleasant places. And this was not all. There was another sort of discouragement with which he had to battle in secret, though of this he would have felt it almost dishonour to complain. But Derrick's keen eyes had seen it long ago, and, understanding it well, he sympathised with his friend accordingly. Yet, despite the many rebuffs the curate had met with, he was not conquered by any means. His was not an easily subdued nature, after all. He was very warm on the subject of Joan Lowrie this evening, so warm indeed that the interest the mere sight of the girl had awakened in Derrick's mind was considerably heightened. They were still speaking of her when they stopped before the door of Grace's modest lodgings. "You will come in, of course," said Paul. "Yes," Derrick answered, "for a short time. I'm tired, and shall feel all the better for a cup of Mrs. Burney's tea," pushing the hair restlessly back from his forehead, as he had a habit of doing when a little excited. He made the small parlour appear smaller than ever when he entered it. He was obliged to bend his head when he passed through the door, and it was not until he had thrown himself into the largest easy chair that the trim apartment seemed to regain its countenance. Grace paused at the table, and with a sudden sensitive flush took up a letter that lay there among 2 or 3 uninteresting-looking epistles. "It is a note from Miss Annice," he said, coming to the hearth and applying his penknife in a gentle way to the small square envelope. "Not a letter, Grace?" said Derrick, with a half smile. "A letter? Oh dear, no. She has never written me a letter. They are always notes with some sort of business object. She has very decided views on the subject of miscellaneous letter-writing." He read the note himself, and then handed it to Derrick. It was a compact, decided hand, free from the least suspicion of an unnecessary curve. "Dear Mr. Grace, many thanks for the book. You are very kind indeed. Pray let us hear something more about your people. I am afraid Papa must find them very discouraging, but I cannot help feeling interested. Grandmamma wishes to be remembered to you. With more thanks, believe me, your friend, Annice Barhome." Derrick refolded the note and handed it back to his friend. To tell the truth, it did not impress him very favourably. A girl not yet 20 years old, who could write such a note as this to a man who loved her, must be rather too self-contained and well-balanced. "You have never told me much of this story of yours, Grace," he said. "There is not much to tell," answered the curate, flushing again, of course. "She is the rector's daughter, and is unlike any other girl in the world. I have known her 3 years. You remember I wrote to you about meeting her while you were in India. As for the rest, I do not exactly understand myself how it is that I have gone so far, having so little encouragement. In fact, having had no encouragement at all. But however that is, it has grown upon me, Derrick. My feeling for her has grown into my life, and there it all lies. She has never cared for me. I am quite sure of that, you see. Indeed, I could hardly expect it. It is not her way to care for men as they are likely to care for her, though it will come some day, I suppose, with the coming man," half smiling. "She is simply what she signs herself here, my friend Annice Barhome, and I am thankful for that much. She would not write even that if she did not mean it." "Bless my soul," broke in Derrick, tossing back his head impatiently. "And she is only 19 yet, you say?" "Only 19, said the curate with simple trustfulness in his friend's sympathy. "But different, you know, from any other woman in the world." The tea and toast came in then, and they sat down together to partake of it. Derrick knew Annice quite well before the meal was ended, and yet he had not asked many questions. He knew how Grace had met her at her father's house, an odd, self-reliant, singularly pretty and youthful-looking little creature, with the force and decision of half a dozen ordinary women hidden in her small frame. How she had seemed to like him, how their intimacy had grown, how his gentle, deep-rooted passion had grown with it, how he had learned to understand that he had nothing to hope for. All the simple history, in fact, with 100 minor points that floated to the surface as they talked. "I am a little fearful for the result of her first visit here," said Grace, pushing his cup aside and looking troubled. "I cannot bear to think of her being disappointed and disturbed by the half-savage state in which these people live. She knows nothing of the mining districts. She has never been in Lancashire, and they have always lived in the south. She is in Kent now with Mr. Barhome's mother, and though I have tried in my short letters to her to prepare her for the rough side of life she will be obliged to see, I am afraid it is impossible for her to realize it, and it may be a sort of a shock to her when she comes." "She is coming to Wigan, then?" said Derek. "In a few weeks. She's been visiting Mrs. Galloway since the rector gave up his living at Ashley Wold, and Mrs. Barhome told me today that she spoke in her last letter of coming to them." The moon was shining brightly when Derek stepped out into the street later in the evening, and though the air was somewhat chill, it was by no means unpleasant. He had rather a long walk before him. He disliked the smoke and dust of the murky little town, and chose to live on its outskirts, but he was fond of sharp exercise, and regarded the distance between his lodging and the field of his daily labour as an advantage. "I work off a great deal of superfluous steam between the two places," he said to Grace at the door. "The wind coming across Boggart Brow as a way of scattering and cooling feverish plans and restless fancies that is good for a man. Half a mile of the Knoll Road is often sufficient to bring morbidness to reason." Tonight, by the time he reached the corner that turned him upon the Knoll Road, his mind had wandered upon an old track, but it had been drawn there by a new object, nothing other than Joan Lowrie indeed. The impression made upon him by the story of Joan and her outcast life was not one easily to be effaced, because the hardest miseries in the lot of a class in whom he could not fail to be interested were grouped about an almost dramatic figure. He was struck, too, by a painful sense of incongruity. "If she had been in this other girl's niche," he said, "if she had lived the life of this Anise—" But he did not finish his sentence. Something not many yards beyond him caught his eye, a figure seated upon the roadside near a collier's cottage, evidently a pit girl in some trouble, for her head was bowed upon her hands, and there was a dogged sort of misery expressed in her very posture. "A woman," he said aloud. "What woman, I wonder? This is not the time for any woman to be sitting there alone." He crossed the road at once, and going to the girl, touched her lightly on her shoulder. "My lass," he said good-naturedly, "what ails you?" She raised her head slowly, as if she were dizzy and bewildered. Her face was disfigured by a bruise, and on one temple was a cut from which the blood trickled down her cheek. But the moonlight showed him that it was Joan. He removed his hand from her shoulder and drew back a pace. "You have been hurt," he exclaimed. "Aye," she answered deliberately. "I've had a hurt, a bad 'un." He did not ask her how she had been hurt. He knew as well as if she'd told him that it had been done in one of her father's fits of drunken passion. He had seen this sort of thing before during his sojourn in the mining districts, but, shamefully repulsive as it had been to him, he had never felt the degradation of it as fiercely as he did now. "You are Joan Lowrie," he said. "Aye, I'm Joan Lowrie, if it'll do you any good to know." "You must have something done to that cut upon your temple," he said next. She put up her hand and wiped the blood away, as if impatient at his persistence. "It'll do well enough as it is," she said. "That is a mistake," he answered. "You are losing more blood than you imagine. Will you let me help you?" She stirred uneasily, but he took no notice of the objection. He drew his handkerchief from his pocket, and after some little effort managed to staunch the bleeding and having done so bound the wound up. Perhaps something in his sympathetic silence and the quiet consideration of his manner touched Joan. Her face, upturned almost submissively, for the moment seemed tremulous, and she set her lips together. She did not speak until he had finished, and then she rose and stood before him, immovable as ever. "Thank you," she said in a suppressed voice. "I canna say no more." "Never mind that," he answered. "I could have done no less. If you could go home now—" "I shall not go home to-neet," she interrupted him abruptly. "You cannot remain out of doors," he exclaimed. "If I do, it wunnot be first time," meeting his startled glance with a pride which defied him to pity or question her. But his sympathy and interest must have stirred her, for the next minute her manner softened. "I've done it often," she added, "and nowt's never feared me. You needna care, mister, I'm used to it." "But I cannot go away and leave you here," he said. "You canna do no other," she answered. "Have you no friends?" he ventured hesitatingly. "No, I have not," she said, hardening again, and she turned away as if she meant to end the discussion. But he would not leave her. The spirit of determination was as strong in his character as in her own. He tore a leaf from his pocket-book and, dashing off a few lines upon it, handed it to her. "If you will take that to Thwaite's wife," he said, "there will be no necessity for your remaining out of doors all night." She took it from him mechanically, but when he finished speaking her calmness left her. Her hand began to tremble, and then her whole frame, and the next instant the note fell to the ground, and she dropped into her old place again, sobbing passionately and hiding her face on her arms. "I wanna tak it," she cried. "I wanna go nowhere and tell as I'm turned like a dog into t' street." Her misery and shame shook her like a tempest, but she subdued herself at last. "I dunna see as you need care," she protested half resentfully. "Other folk dunna. I'm left to mysen most at times." Her head fell again and she trembled all over. "But I do care," he returned. "I cannot leave you here, and will not, if you will trust me and do as I tell you. The people you go to need know nothing you do not choose to tell them." It was evident that his determination made her falter, and seeing this he followed up his advantage, and so far improved it that at last, after a few more arguments, she rose slowly and picked up the fallen paper. "If I mun go, I mun," she said, twisting it nervously in her fingers, and then there was a pause, in which she plainly lingered to say something, for she stood before him with a restrained air and downcast face. She broke the silence herself, however, suddenly looking up and fixing her large eyes fully upon him. "If I were a lady," she said, "happen I should know what to say to you, but being what I am, I dunna. Happen as you're a gentleman, you know what I'd like to say, and canna. Happen you do." Even as she spoke, the ever-present element of defiance in her nature struggled against the finer instinct of gratitude. But the finer instinct conquered, and when her eyes fell before his, her whole being softened into a novel dignity of womanliness. He knew, however, even while recognizing this, that words would not please her, so he was as brief as possible in his reply. "We will not speak of thanks," he said. "I may need help some day, and come to you for it." Her head went up at once. A sudden glow fell upon her. "If you ever need help at pit, will you come to me?" she demanded. "I've seen time as I could have given help to mesters if I'd had mind. If you'll promise that—" "I will promise it," he answered her, "and I'll promise to give it you. So that's settled. Now I'll go my ways. Good night to you." "Good night," he returned, and uncovering his head with as grave a courtesy as he might have shown to the finest lady in the land, or to his own mother or sister, he stood at the roadside and watched her until she was out of sight.